Okay, I think it's about time that I make a best of one deck tier list. I really enjoy making these tier lists, and as a best of three player primarily, obviously I don't have as much experience playing best of one, but I am always interested in exploring the theory behind a metagame and what I think that metagame is and where I would rank decks. And that ranking might heavily disagree with other primarily best of one players, which is going to be really interesting. So this is a best of one deck tier list from the perspective of a best of three player. And of course, I have played a decent amount of best of one, obviously not as much as primarily best of one players, but I have some experience with some of these decks, and I have experience playing against almost all of the decks I'm going to be ranking. Now, as you can see here at the bottom, there are some decks I'm probably not going to be ranking just because I don't see them as much in best of one. I don't really see the point. But yeah, anyways, let's just jump right into things and let's get this started. First on the list, we're going to be talking about my favorite best of three deck. It's a simple one. It's Dimir. Two colors, just works really well with the mana. We have the fast land as well, and we have a variety of tools that can deal with just about anything in best of three. Now, in best of one, that power doesn't translate as well because counter magic is not as good. So make disappear is still fine in best of one, but the problem is when you're on the draw, that counter spell, you're not really going to have the time to hold that up for a threat. Most of the time you're going to be behind and you're going to need to either you have a perfect hand or you have removal spell on one and then maybe you can use it, but if you don't, that counter spell is going to have you taking so much more damage than if you just had a removal spell for your opponent's 1 to 2 drop. The problem is decks are way faster in best of one, potentially, unless you're facing a control deck. In that case, the counter spell is good. But decks are way faster, they go wider, and while Dimir does have sweepers like Path of Peril or whatever that -1/-1 sweeper is that can turn into -3/-3 against white and green, but those sweepers are conditional and also don't deal with everything reliably. And in matchups where they're not useful, you don't have many ways of getting rid of those cards. So it can be really troublesome to build either. You basically would have to commit to either being an anti-aggro deck, where you play a lot of removal spells, or being a more tempo-based deck, but in that case, the blue doesn't contribute to much, because the blue is mostly there for counter magic and Kaito. So I'm going to be placing Dimir safely in B tier. Next up, we have another deck that I ranked really highly in the best of three tier list at the time, and that's going to be Esper Control. I'm just going to place it here for now. Esper Control is not that good in best of one, and the main reason for that is the mana base. The issue is once you play a lot of tap lands, and in this case, Esper Control will have to play the tri lands that come in tapped, and you also have to play a lot of fast lands because you don't want to take damage from pain lands, and you have slow lands. It makes the mana base overall just too clunky, and I think the potential upside of having that third color is not that good. I think you're either better off playing blue-white or you're better off playing Orzhov. So I'm going to be placing Esper Control in C tier. Next up, in the third deck that I placed in S tier in the best of three tier list, it's going to be Esper Legends, and I believe Esper Legends is still fantastic. The reason for that is the mana base is just so good. And the power spike you get from playing three colors is actually relevant. Unlike with Esper Control, every color you have in the deck makes sense, and they're all creatures, so they can play proactively. And some of these creatures act relatively defensive, and that would be the case for Dennick. That would be the case for Shieldred, among other cards that you could play that can potentially gain life, or fly, or be like good bodies to block in the case of facing down mono red or stuff like that. So the additional life gain that you have integrated into the deck is fantastic for many aggro matchups, and it also has the capabilities of out aggroing those decks and also being a very high tempo deck against controlling decks with some counter magic in Urtai and some disruption with Thalia. But there is one major downside for Esper Legends, and it's going to be against decks that go wide. The issue with best of one is that you're always going to have one losing matchup, I think, and that means the deck isn't quite S tier. What I consider S tier is a deck that basically has no bad matchups, and if it does have a bad matchup, it's a deck that is very, very specific and is not that widespread. In the case of Esper Legends, once you're facing down a deck like Soldiers, it can be troublesome. Once you're facing down enchantments, it can be very troublesome. And when you're facing down mono white humans as well, you're going to be in trouble. So I'm going to be placing Esper Legends in A tier as a solid deck, but has some weaknesses that can be exploited. Moving along, I'm going to be talking about the dual color decks. And we're going to start things off with Selesnya Enchantments. And I think Selesnya Enchantments is very strong. The reason is it has very high explosive power with a good curve, but it also has access to some lifelink, and it has some tricky card advantage elements baked in. And I think it has great like burst stats. So you can really stack a creature and swing for a ton of damage early, and it can really overwhelm some opponents alongside you having great exile based removal, which is fantastic in certain matchups. And I think Selesnya is just overall good as a deck that can play on the draw as well because of its one drops, and also be very powerful on the play, as I mentioned. I do think Selesnya has a relatively big weakness though, and that is the fact that it requires synergy between its parts. Usually you need multiple cards to be in your hand and casting them in succession to really get things going. That can be disrupted pretty easily by any type of removal spell, and in some cases go wide board states will manage to go wide enough to kind of overpower you with like a potential, as long as they remove your big creature, because you can only have like one big creature that you're going to stack with all the stuff. And I think even a deck like Humans would be able to Cathar potentially if they draw it. And especially on the draw, your removal spells aren't that fast. They're mostly like 2 mana enchantments, unless you get the Drukai Naturalist out. But some of the removal spells can be really slow against go wide decks. And I think that is enough of a weakness, combined with the fact that, against control, if they manage to survive until they find an exile sweeper, you're just absolutely screwed as well. So I think Selesnya is probably an A tier. Now, is it worse than Esper Legends? That's a tough one. For me, I would rate them about the same. But I do think Selesnya is probably a little bit better than Esper. So I'm going to be placing it like this. There we go. Okay, next up we have Blue-White Control, a deck that I think is not good as well, but it's a little bit better than Esper. I think the deck is very high roll, very difficult to stabilize early, as it has not the best tools, I think, to deal with early game creatures. It does have Lay, usually. I think you should be playing Lay if you're going to play Blue-White Control. But essentially, the goal is to stall until you find a big sweeper, and then cast that sweeper and, cast a bunch of card draw after and overwhelm your opponent with card advantage. While you also have a lot of ways to life gain, I think the deck is just a little bit too inconsistent and suffers greatly from being on the draw, especially against cards like Thalia. And I think that is enough of a weakness that it puts blue-white in a very weird spot and very inconsistent spot. It's a deck that you will either crush your opponent because it has very good matchups, or you'll just lose all the time because, the deck is not consistent. I don't think it's worth playing. I think playing proactive decks is almost always recommended, not only because you save time, but also because the deck is going to be more consistent at being on the play and being good on the play because you're playing a proactive game plan. And for those reasons, I'm going to be placing Blue-White Control in C tier as well, but above Esper Control because the mana base is a little better. Now, next up on the list, we have Soldiers. And I think Soldiers is still good. I have not seen him much in Best of One, but in theory, I think they have just about good. They have a good game plan against just about everything. I think Harbin is absolutely insane and gives you an easy out to finish the game off with a bunch of flyers attacking. And I think that is a really, really big upside. I believe Soldiers are still fantastic, but will potentially struggle against Mono Red depending on how it's built. But you would have to build a soldier deck in a more aggressive way. I don't think you should be playing the 2/3 that can make a 1/1 and draw cards. I think your deck has to be a little bit more all in, a little bit more aggressive, so you're sacrificing card advantage to potentially gain a lot more tempo. Yeah, anyways, I think Soldier's pretty straightforward. It goes wide, it has good finishers. I would definitely place it in A tier. And I think it is better than Esper Legends, but probably a little bit worse than Selesnya. Okay, let's stick with the go wide strategies. Let's go with Selesnya Toxic. And I think the best version of it is definitely the one that relies on creatures, that has Skrelv's Hive and stuff like that. I think Selesnya Toxic is not great. I think its overall game plan is too slow, and it doesn't have the best stat lines unless we're talking about the 3 mana 4/4, which is absolutely disgusting. but that's really the only creature that is a real threat, I think, to any other proactive deck. And the creatures are overall relatively easy to block. Now, Rot Priest can really cause some issues for some decks, but I think the overall consistency of Silesian Toxic is not that high. So I'm going to be placing it at the top of C tier. Next up, another go wide deck. I guess not as go wide is going to be Naya. I think Naya humans specifically. So you're playing Naya. You're playing basically mono white with the green and the red splash with those lands, the tribal lands and the legendary land, to be able to cast a few key legendaries from other colors. And I believe this deck is not great. So at first, in theory, I thought it would be good. And I think the issue is that the cards that you're adding are actually not that powerful on their own. They're mostly cards that will snowball the game for you if you're already winning, but you're taking a consistency loss by playing a bunch of weird lands as well that can possibly sometimes screw you over. I think it's just not worth the power spike of potentially, snowballing with Alana and Elena, I think it's called. And the overall power spike you're gaining doesn't help you close out the game in a situation where both players have the board kind of set up. So that's my main issue right now, is that it doesn't really have access to flying, it doesn't have access to trample, it doesn't have access to burn. It has a little bit of a slower curve because you're playing a lot more 4-drops due to those legendaries that you want to cast. I just don't think this deck is very good. I'm probably going to be placing this deck in C tier. All right, lastly, when we're talking about board presence, we should definitely mention mono white. I think mono white is probably the better of the go wide decks just because it's more consistent. It has very high stat line, very efficient stat line, a lot of anthem effects. I guess not. Yeah, it does have a lot of anthem effects, kind of. It has that new human that can give ward and +1/+0. It also has the other thing that you can, when you play it, I forget, it's lifelink 3/1. It comes into play, you can pay 2 and you get a +1/+1 on your whole board. And it also has lifelink, so that's also fantastic against mono red. So yeah, I think humans has a lot of tools. I think you can build it in a few, maybe one or two ways, really. You can go the more card advantage route, or you can go the more aggressive route. And I think both are good. And they're both very good on the play, but they are a little bit tough to play on the draw. I think sometimes it really depends what you're facing, but I guess every deck is, not great on the draw, so it's not really like a super downside. Since your curve is still low, you can probably take over even on the draw. But yeah, I would probably place soldiers above humans. I don't know if it's better than Selesnya though. I'm trying to think. I think I would probably put it above Selesnya just because its power comes from individual creatures like coming to, like, they're all good creatures by themselves and they just synergize with other creatures. It's not like you're just stacking one big thing potentially and just trying to go in with that if that gets removed. So yeah, actually I would put humans above Celestia. All right, there we go. We have humans there. Now we're gonna move on to, I guess I'll just mention decks that I don't really care to place that much. I guess I will place everything. So we're just gonna go over just mono white mid range. I think mono white mid range is fine. I think it struggles greatly with decks that are going to disrupt it, whether that be with some counter magic, but we don't see that much of it, or just taxing in general. And I think its tools are a little bit slow. So, I don't think it's horrible. I don't think it's horrible because it has a lot of tools. It's lacking card advantage with Bankbuster. Yeah, actually, now that I think about it, I think the loss of Bankbuster means this deck is actually trash. I'm trying to think of a situation where it would be good. You have to basically get to your first sweeper, but I'm not sure it can do that reliably. I'm not sure it can do that reliably against most decks. It's probably not D tier though. If I had to guess, I would put it. Is it better than Blue Eye Control? Probably not. I think Blue Eye Control has that card draw because that's what mono white. So it's basically a better mono white. And I think Esper is also better. I would say Naya. It might be D tier actually, honestly. Compared to all this, I think I would rather play any of these decks than this, and I think it's worth putting a tier lower. Okay, I'm gonna put mono white in D tier. Orzhov is basically mono white with black, so it's kind of like adding blue, but black for removal. But again, it's going to lack card advantage. But you do gain potentially some things that are really interesting, like Shield Red, which I think is a really good creature. And you also get some 3-mana sweepers as well. You could play Lockdown, I guess, if you're playing just like a white deck. But having Path of Peril with the white additionally like in the deck as a color, I think that makes it better than mono white for sure. I don't know if it's better than blue white. It could be, it might actually be better than blue white. I'm going to be honest. Just because I think blue doesn't have time necessarily. Like all the blue spells are completely useless unless you're stable. And I think that's a problem with best of one. I think being on the draw is like how bad your deck is on the draw, I think is what you should be looking at. I think blue white is terrible on the draw. Okay, I'm probably gonna put ores up above blue white. Is it better than toxic? Probably not. I think all these kind of controlling decks are not great. Actually, it might be better. You know what? Having the black, I think, is so good. Like, there's so many options that open up to you from having the black in the deck. Okay, I'm gonna put it above Selesnya. I feel like Selesnya is just kind of weak. I don't think it does that much. All right, very quickly, let's place Rakdos midrange. I think Rakdos midrange is just bad. I don't I don't think you have a single reason of playing it. I'll just put it like that. It's like I don't know. It doesn't do anything. The red doesn't do anything. I think that's the issue. The red, you're just getting it for Harvester. But like there's clearly better. I guess it's not like bad because it has a black base. It's not that bad. So I think I would probably place it above like some of these. That you do still have Lily potentially. I just don't know why you would want. I just don't see a reason to play it. I don't think it's bad, but there's no reason to play this, right? I'll just put it here. Okay, really quickly, Gruul I think is terrible. So we can put that there. I'm not even gonna I'm not even gonna talk about it. Mono blue is interesting. I think mono blue is a deck that's gonna be well, it's a high roll deck. It's a deck that you either find what you want or you don't. The coin flip for play draw is a massive loss for this deck. I think when you're on the draw with mono blue, you're gonna be in trouble, especially because your main creature counterspell can only come down on turn 2. And if your opponent goes turn 1, turn 2, as you can see in these decks right here, these have a very, except for legends, will have a pretty high chance of having a 1-drop. And I think that's extremely scary for mono blue because they'll just keep falling behind. Now, if they can stabilize with the serpents and the Jin, things can go south really quickly. So I think it still has potential. I think it's still a good deck, but it's not a consistent deck, and I think that's the major issue with it. I would probably put it. Is it better than Dimir? Yeah, I think it is better than Dimir, just because its power spike is higher. Like and it also has a really good control matchup. I think that shouldn't be understated. That if your deck is very good against control, because some people are playing control, I think that's something you should keep in mind. So yeah, I think mono blue actually should be valued. Maybe the value of mono blue, because it's still really good on the play, should be placed a little bit higher. I'm hesitating between like here basically and here, just because its matchup against control is pretty much unmatched. I think it just dominates control, and that's something that is worth something. Yeah, okay, I'll respect that. I'll respectfully put it in A. I still think it's at the bottom. I think these are just more consistent overall. If you're taking about the wide scope of the metagame, you're facing mostly aggro decks. I think this is not as good. But sometimes you face some control decks, so that's like a free win. And you can also free win against aggro if you're on the play, if you get a good hand. The problem is the hand is wildly like the variables are just too high. I think there's too many variables. Okay, next, screw it, I'll just place it now. I mean, this is just too obvious. Like mono red has, in my opinion, no bad matchups. I think the only bad matchups it could have would be like a hyper life gain, like a super I hate mono red deck, like some kind of maybe blue white control with like the Sunset Revelry and then more life gain and more life gain, more life gain. You can beat mono red with that. It's probably the only way, but then your blue white deck is absolutely garbage against everything else. So I think the life gain strat just doesn't really work well against anything but mono red, I feel like. But yeah, mono red can beat just about anything. I think it can even beat the life gain blue. It can still beat it. Like blue is just so inconsistent. You sometimes you just don't draw your card draw. You just life gain, and then they still have a board state. You don't draw your sweeper. Like there's so much that can go wrong. And the more you build your deck to beat mono red, as a control deck, the worse your deck is overall. So yeah, I don't know. This is just unmatched. I mean, it's pretty obvious. I think it's just a really good deck. I don't have much to say about it really. Next up, we have the Mono Black deck. Mono Black, a deck that I love. It's my favorite best of one deck. It's the deck that I find to be the most consistent on the draw, actually. I think this is the deck with the highest upside from being on the draw because you do have the extra card and you do have a ton of removal spells, and the black removal spells are extremely efficient. Combined with the black creatures that can life gain as well, it gives you good comeback potential. You have some good planeswalkers in there. You have some good sweepers with the cruel, what is it, Gix's command. So yeah, I think mono black has a very good matchup against mono red, and that's the reason I rate it so highly. It also has good matchups against go wide decks because you have those bigger creatures, those taller creatures, and a lot of removal spells to remove like their really annoying threats, and you also have a few sweepers baked in. So overall, it's a very complete deck. It does fall into the trap of, you know, having too many anti-creature cards, like a lot of removal, and then you're going to struggle against Esper, and you're not Esper, control decks in general. So you're going to struggle against control, but there are ways to kind of mitigate that. You can play some Phyrexian Arenas, you can play Gix and lower the curve. There's a lot of ways to build mono black, and I think it is very viable. And you can also play sweepers if you're just going full anti-aggro. You can play more planeswalkers that will help you against control as well. There are a lot of things you can do. You can even play duress main deck. I've seen some people do that, and it seems to be working pretty well. I think mono black is just very good. So I'm going to be placing it in A tier. Now, where in A tier is the bigger question. I do think it's better than Selesnya, so we can move at least all of these back. The question is if it is or isn't better than mono white humans. Let's so to kind of break this stalemate between these two right now, which one has the better mono red matchup? I think that solves the issue, and I think it's mono black. So I think both the human deck and mono black are going to struggle somewhat against like very early or not very early. They both struggle against different sweepers. Like mono black is going to struggle against cards like Sunfall, and mono white's going to struggle against Path of Peril. It's going to struggle against Lockdown. It's going to struggle against the -1/-1 thing. I don't even think that's played, but maybe some crazy people are playing it. But yeah, the early game sweepers don't hurt mono black as much. The thing that hurts mono black is card draw, but I think most of the control decks should be careful with card draw because those are dead cards against aggro until you're winning. So yeah, I would put mono black. Yeah, I think it's probably, I would say it's probably the most consistently good deck out of all of these. Lastly, we have 5-color, and actually, the more I thought about 5-color, the more I think it's actually good, or 4-color or whatever. Any ramp deck. I feel like the early game answers to creatures are good. You can also play sweepers. You can also ramp into big spells. You have some life gain with the Archangel of Wrath. Honestly, I think ramp is really good. Like if you think about what you might be facing. So you're facing mono red. While you have some life gain, you've got some early game removal with the binding, and you also could play, you're probably playing late. I think you're supposed to play late. I'm not exactly sure. You can play lockdown as well. You can play, if you're not playing lockdown, you can play the ossification as well. So you got a lot of early game answers, and you can play some life gain in that deck because you have white. So having access to that, having access to sweepers, having access to big cards, having access to even more life gain with the herd, is it herd migration? I don't remember what it's called. I think it's herd migration, the thing where you can what is it, cycle it, channel it for 3 life, and you search for a land, 2 mana. So yeah, there's a lot of life gain in that deck, and I think it has really good stuff going for it. In theory, I would actually put this here, honestly. I think it would have good matchups against just about everything except for like very heavy counter control decks. It will beat mono black 100%. Like this is not even close. I think mono red, it's like kind of play draw dependent, but I think mono red could lose if this is on the play. And I think it beats Selesnya pretty easily. Soldiers, maybe not. It depends. Soldiers can go pretty fast. Mono white humans also depends, I think, but they don't have as much. I mean, no, they have good bursts. It's just if you fall into lockdown. The problem with soldiers and humans, I think, is just they fall pretty hard into like 3 mana sweepers. And I think you could play this deck with 3 mana sweepers. Legends might be a little difficult, I guess. That's probably no, because you have single target removal. Yeah, actually, you know what? I would place this in S tier. I think it's really good. The more I think about it, the more I think it's good. It's also pretty good against mono blue because you have the flash bindings. You could play Wandering Emperor as well. I like it. I think it's good. So we don't have that much in B tier. Does that mean I should move things around? Do I really think that these are one tier below these? Honestly, I would probably, you know what, I might move this up. No. Maybe I move things down? No, I do. I agree that all like best of one is a format that's weird. A lot of decks are really good, but have like a very, very bad weakness. Like these all qualify. Demir, yeah, is a little bit better than these. I would agree with that. And then I think all these are just worse than Demir. Yeah, I don't know. I'm okay with this. I think I'm fine with this. There's nothing I really want to move. There's nothing I'm like inclined to move. Maybe Rakdos could be like here. This is all I'm thinking. It's possible. Like I just because it is basically slightly worse mono black, right? So yeah, that is gonna do it for my best of one deck tier list. Of course, as I went over before, this is just a lot of theory and a few decks that I have actually playing against other decks. And what I value most in Best of One, as you may have seen me talk about it quite a bit during this explanation on where I'm placing decks, I value consistency in the fact that either your deck is extremely powerful and has ways to just snowball pretty easily. All of these would qualify, well, except for mono black. You could build mono black in that way. But the other thing I value the most is how good is your deck on the draw. And I think a deck like mono red, a deck like mono black, a deck like 5-color, these decks have decent potential on the draw, or if not good, or at least they're better than some of these other decks, I think, on the draw, where them being on the draw can really set them back. I think mono black having good removal, same for 5-color. I think they both have really good cheap removal spells. It means that the extra card could matter. And I think for mono red, it's kind of the same thing where you have so many 1-drops that you can just start the game off on turn 1 and potentially snowball your opponent anyways. So yeah, that's going to do it for me. Hope you enjoyed this tier list, and I'll see you in the next video. If you enjoy my content and would like to help me keep making it, consider supporting me over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a bunch of bonus videos, as well as other rewards depending on the tiers. And thank you so much to all the lovely patrons that are already subscribed. I appreciate it very much. And I will see you all in the next video.